Hi everyone, I'm delighted to be here moderating this event at the Atlantic Council on the Iran-Russia alliance, opportunities, limits, and conflict in the Middle East. And I'd like to thank the Eurasia Center here and the Iran Strategy Project for their help in making today's event possible. I'm joined here by a great group of 3 experts to discuss some of the issues surrounding the relationship between Iran and Russia, as well as its limits today. With me today is Mark Katz, who's a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Middle East programs. Mark is also a professor of government and politics at the George Mason University School of Policy and Government. He primarily researches Russian foreign policy, especially towards the Middle East. Nicole Grajewski is a fellow in the nuclear policy program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and an associate researcher with the project on managing the atom at Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Her research examines Russian and Iranian policies in the global nuclear order. And Deborah Kagan is a senior advisor at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, providing expertise on security and energy issues. She's also a distinguished fellow at the Transatlantic Leadership Network and senior advisory board member for Strategy East. Kagan has also served in a range of senior roles at both the State Department and Defense Departments. So first of all, I'd like to ask you all, how we got here, a little bit how we got to the point of holding this event in the first place. Iran and Russia have historically been rivals going back a long time. Iran's former supreme leader, Ruhollah Khomeini, scorned the then Soviet Union's godless communism, and even today the 2 countries continue to compete, particularly over exports on oil and crude, particularly to Asia. So what have been the key moments and factors in bringing Iran and Russia into the close relationship which they're currently in? Let's start with you here.
Well, certainly, as you mentioned, in the past, there have been a lot of differences between Iran and Russia, and there still are differences, but more recently, they share common ground with regard to differences with the United States in particular, also with the West in general. And certainly, they're both under sanctions. They're both they both are opposed to American policy in several areas, not exactly the same necessarily, but that I think is what holds the relationship together. And so long as their differences with the U.S. Are so great, they're going to overlook their differences with each other.
So I think you guys would like to add about how this relationship has developed over the last couple of years.
Well, I think that you can really go back to the Syrian civil war, which brought those 2 countries together. So overnight in Syria, Russia and Iran formed a kind of irregular military coalition in support of the Assad regime. This led to kind of this expansion of contacts across the bureaucracies, both in Russia and Iran. And we kind of see that coming into play in Ukraine with a lot of these similar figures coming and playing quite a prominent role in facilitating the procurement of drones. So Russia and Iran have had this kind of mutual antipathy towards the United States, towards this kind of Western international order, but it's also been strengthened by this increase in contacts and this more regularized relationship.
And Deborah, could I ask you how you think the war in Ukraine has played a role in pushing these countries together?
Well, I think, I think everyone kind of got it wrong about how Ukraine would perform, what Russia would perform, and the like. And I think the sanctions did hurt Russia in ways that Russia didn't think they would. And so having that closer tie with Iran, not just on the drones, but on manufacturing of spare parts and other things for Russian equipment made sense. And for years, let's not forget, Russia was going back to Soviet times, and Russia was a supplier of arms and equipment to Iran post-revolution. It goes back quite a ways, as my colleagues know very well. And so I think this has drawn that connection with directly with Ukraine and how Russia's behaved. But I want to add one other point to what my colleagues just said. Russia has been able to, it has a sophistication and technology that neither Iran or Hezbollah or Syria has. And so Russia's support in Syria has allowed that team of people to be more deadly than they would have been otherwise.
Interesting. And well, we've seen these 2 powers draw closer over the last year and a half, perhaps particularly since the war in Ukraine and even before that in Syria. I'm wondering what you would describe. I mean, we've heard now what Russia's getting out of the relationship as far as drones, spare parts manufacturing, and so on. A little bit more about what both parts are getting out of this relationship, as well as both assistance in evading sanctions and in weapons manufacturing, but also if there are other areas in which Russian-Iranian cooperation has extended in the economic spheres.
Well, certainly, Iran has an awful lot of experience with evading sanctions, and there's reportedly lots of Russians are getting advice, good advice from the Iranians on this. So there's certainly that. I also just think in general, with regard to this war in Ukraine, although I don't think the Iranians actually recognize the Russian occupation or the Russian claims to Ukrainian territory, but I think that for Iran, they simply cannot afford to see Russia lose. They can't afford to see Russia humiliated because that would have very negative implications for them. They need Russia to be able to stay strong and to work in partnership with them.
Well, on the economic side, the Russia-Iran relationship has always been weakest there. They haven't really had this kind of substantial bilateral economic relationship akin to Iran and China or Russia-China. This hasn't been the major aspect of it. But since the war in Ukraine, there has been a push towards previous transportation initiatives like the North-South Transit Corridor. There's also been a push towards sanction evasion, and that's really coming into play with Iran providing Russia with some of their expertise out of its playbook, whether it's masking the kind of the origins of Iranian crude, Russia's been practicing that as well, or also blending military and economic dynamics together, which we've seen in the Caspian Sea. I think that Iran gets a lot out of its relationship with Russia, at least the leadership does. The leadership views this war as kind of a testament to the narrative of the West's nefarious actions. This has been articulated multiple times across the elite spectrum. And they also, I think, covet the opportunity to have their drones being used against Western armaments. I think that this is something that they're quite proud of. You've seen this from IRGC officers hailing the advance of Iranian drones and having the ability to sell it to countries like Russia.
I see you were taking some notes here.
No,
I don't know if there's anything you'd want to add.
No, I would say I really don't want to comment on the economic side of it because it's I know what I don't know, and a benefit of age, I'd say. But I will say that just a couple of things on the benefits that Iran has gotten out of Russia. One, the incredibly outrageous use of chemical weapons against the Syrian people would not have been possible without Russia's help. Neither Iran nor Syria had the aerosolization technology to do this, and Russia had to help do that. There's a number of other things in terms of airspace control, Joint Tactical Air Control Center for Russia. So things don't happen in the Levant without Russia being aware of them because they have the bigger picture of everything that's going on there. And those two assets are critical to any of Iran's success in that region.
And can I ask you all, if we were to see this relationship strengthen over time, what kind of things you would might be looking for or might think that Moscow and Tehran might be considering? I mean, we've seen U.S. officials express concern regarding potential of Iran providing short-range ballistic missiles, although they might want to keep those now given the unrest in the Middle East, but also potential for manpower, providing manpower to Ukraine. And we've seen Ukrainian officials claiming that they've killed Iranian military advisors in Crimea, for example, who were there advising. I'm wondering if this relationship were to deepen, what ramifications that would have and where would be most likely to see that play out.
Well, I think one thing we have seen with Russian diplomacy is that they have been, Putin's been very careful about supporting opposing sides simultaneously, or at least having good relations with opposing sides. So even though Russia has increased relations with Iran, they're also working with the Saudis, with the Emiratis, and that, at least up until the recent past, their relationship with Israel has been surprisingly good. But I think, though, that going forward, if in fact we see Russia and Iran becoming more dependent on one another, I'm just wondering how whether Russia will still be able to play this more even-handed game. I think we're seeing already that that they're less sympathetic toward the Israelis, and now there seems to be a Russian domestic political aspect. We saw the riots in Dagestan with regard to the anti-Israeli business, and so I think that now the Middle Eastern war has become a domestic political factor that Putin may have helped stoke it, but that it's not clear he can completely control it. I'm also wondering about whether they'll be able to work as successfully with the Saudis and the Emiratis. Both of those governments are certainly going to try, but I think the balancing act is becoming more difficult now for Russia.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. I think one of the repercussions of the war in Ukraine for Russia's Middle East policy was that Russia became a lot more reliant on its partnerships in the region, and it really diminished its opportunity to balance. Also, Ukraine brings out a lot of the hypocrisy within Russia's positions, but Russia has also been trying to court the region and kind of show that there is some kind of cohesive narrative to its actions. In terms of the future of the Russia-Iran relationship and where this can develop, I think there's areas with space cooperation which could potentially have implications for Iran's missile technology. Russia, which I don't see this as likely, but Russia could provide some more technological support for Iran's potential weaponization if Iran does decide to have a nuclear weapon or shield it, at least in international forums. There certainly seems to be a shift in Russia's position on the Iran nuclear file recently, but it's unlikely that Russia's going to provide Iran with that kind of level of technology. But I mean, I think it is possible to consider it, but it doesn't seem very likely.
And could I follow up with you, Nicole, on how you describe Russia vis-a-vis the Iran nuclear file, and perhaps also conversely, whether we've seen the kind of condemnation from Tehran that we've seen even from China, where Xi Jinping and other Chinese officials have been clear that they don't want to see Russian nuclear use in Ukraine, that would be something that they would strongly oppose.
Well, there's certainly been statements from the Iranians suggesting that any kind of implication that Russia would have nuclear use in Ukraine is Western propaganda. I mean, that is very consistent with the Iranian narrative. But what's interesting is on the Iran nuclear file, because even after the 2014 annexation of Crimea, Russia was largely cooperative on the Iran nuclear file. We eventually got the JCPOA. Russia was on board with that. Russia played a pretty large technical role in shipping out the excess uranium from Iran. And that was the assumption going into the talks on revitalizing the JCPOA, that Russia would play this technical role, would play this role in kind of reining in Iran. That wasn't the case after the war in Ukraine, where Sergei Lavrov comes out and says, we'd like guarantees that our cooperation with Iran won't be hindered by sanctions, and kind of holding the nuclear deal hostage. Since then, Russia's shielded Iran on the Board of Governors from whenever there's kind of been outrage over Iran's conduct towards inspections and also towards verification, which Iran's been very averse to since the war in Ukraine. So this dynamic is actually really impacting the development of Iran's nuclear program and the international response to it.
I think there's been a falsehood. So I'm gonna take issue with some of the JCPOA issues here. And one of it is that, yes, Russia took some of the excess fissionable material back and that sort of thing. But when you re-entered this in the Biden administration, I think there was a sense of naivete about what Russia's plans were, especially because they had already gone back into Ukraine in 2014. And Putin had been talking about changing his nuclear posture for quite some time and the like, and we knew that. And I think that I agree with Nicole that Russia has helped shielded them. They have helped blocked inspections writ large. Russia knows exactly what Iran can do with its nuclear program because they gave the centrifuges to Iran in the first place. They know exactly what they're doing with this. They know exactly what they can and cannot do. But the one thing I will add to that is that I think Iran would have a real problem with those Russian nuclear threats because Iran's nuclear deterrent is tiny. It's tiny. It's a fig leaf. And if Russia uses a handful of Iskander missiles in Ukraine and no one reacts because the Ukrainians don't mass forces. You can't really strike a lot of them at one time. We all know what the Iskander can do. Iran has the same missile. We know what it can't do. We know what the yield would be. We know that some of that yield would be no more than what the Russians have already done at Zaporizhia. So for Iran, that undercuts their nuclear deterrent. That undercuts their threat. If Russia does that and people say, well, this is rather feckless, for Iran, I think that they had real opposition when Putin started talking that way, because it undercuts that threat that they have. And oh, by the way, I just put this out there knowing Nicole does this, but enriching uranium to 85% and saying it's not at nuclear weapons capability is a fallacy. In the late 40s and early 50s, the United States tested nuclear weapons at 40 to 50% highly enriched uranium, HEU, and they still blew up really big. And so it is kind of a fallacy to say that they have to hit this 90% mark. And I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah. And could I ask you as well, Deborah, what kind of things you'll be tracking on, especially the weapons and arms and the military front, as far as Iran-Russia collaboration going forwards? I mean, are there specific systems you might be looking at, or other issues which you think are particularly salient here?
Yeah, I think the biggest issue for the U.S. and for other countries in the region is going to be whether Russia decides that they need things from Iran so much that they're willing to trade more highly technical missile technology for them. And Nicole's right about the space program, because that's a great way to sort of hide missile technology. I mean, other countries have done that. India and Pakistan did that for years. And so I think this is the thing that Israel's most worried about. This is the thing that the U.S. is concerned about. How much technology is Russia willing to give to Iran in exchange for what it needs to prosecute its war in Ukraine? And I think that, to me, is a tipping point for a lot of countries in the region. I think I'll turn to my colleagues here who know this better, but I think that's something that probably would concern the Saudis as well and the Emiratis. But this is something that we know Iran wants, because they have the missile technology, but it isn't that great. It's good enough to kill people, but not as many people as they might want to kill, and how they might want to use it. Is Russia going to share a lot of the electronic countermeasures of how you can more effectively jam what the Israelis have, for example? Things that they've learned against more sophisticated Western equipment in Ukraine. So that's another piece to that. So I think that's what I'm watching. If you were saying, that's what I'm looking at.
Yeah. And do you think in written statements or otherwise that we've seen any, what's your sense of where Russia are? Do you think there are limits now, and I guess this goes to all of you, of what kind of advanced weaponry they would provide, or are we seeing that this will most likely only be headed in one direction?
Oh, I think everything is going to be a trade-off. I think one could have argued 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, and I turned to Nicole and on this as well, that it may have been the Russian tail wagging the dog at that point. But now I think that Iranian tail is wagging the dog pretty strongly, because if you see something that someone needs more than you do, then that's something that you can take advantage of. And so I think that's what I'm watching, is to say, where is that? Is this an even-handed relationship, or does one of those countries have the upper hand so it can demand more? And that's what, to me, has been more concerning about this, that at some point there's going to be an issue where Iran says, okay, this is great, but now I need this plus.
If I could just, I think, add just one caveat, I think that what Iran won't get from the Russians is what the Russians themselves need for Ukraine. We've seen already the Russians have been actually buying back weapons they've sold to India and Myanmar, and so I think that there's a limit to what they're willing to trade. In other words, if they want to use it now, then they're not going to send it necessarily. And there seems to be some kerfuffle with the Su-35s that were originally intended for Egypt, supposedly going to Iran, but they haven't quite seemed to make it over there yet, and it's not quite clear exactly why. So it strikes me that the Russians, In other words, if despite their dependence on Iran, they can still be difficult partners for the Iranians. It seems to me that has not changed.
If I can just add one other piece to that. I think on the Sukhois, when, of course, the Iranians showed up at that facility where they'd never been before, so that was obvious. But on the Sukhois, I don't know if that's a political decision at this point or if it was a computer chip problem. The Russians were having a problem fulfilling what they needed for that supply line in any event. And so I don't know at this point if this is a political decision or they can't produce these in the numbers that they would need to produce them to sort of get them to Iran right away. In any event, in Ukraine, the Russians are not, they use their aircraft as an asset to like a ground platform. It supports the ground forces. They're not doing any dogfighting at all. So I'm not sure the Sukhoi 35 would be that necessary of an asset for them in Ukraine the way they've been prosecuting the war.
Yeah, on the Su-35s, so the Yak-130s were delivered to Iran, which is kind of a precursor to the Su-35 because that's what you train pilots with. But it seems like there wouldn't be an arms agreement between Russia and Iran if there wasn't some kind of issue. In the past, this has been a major area of tension between Russia and Iran, like the S-300, which was kind of wound up in UN sanctions, and then it got canceled, then eventually delivered. This has been something that's been a constant in the relationship. But there's also issues with payment, and I think that's something that's also been historically an issue with the Russia-Iran relationship. But with this is that now I think that Russia was previously hesitant on allowing Iran to purchase any equipment on barter. And it appears from Russian sources that the Sukhois will be purchased on barter. So there will be some kind of oil swap agreement. With Iran drones, for example, Russia offered Iran in gold, but Iran preferred US dollars. So this payment side of it is also like really important to look at and how they use illicit financing and third-party intermediaries to facilitate this as well.
And it's always been like that, it seems. Certainly with regard to finishing the reactor, it was a question of, well, would Iran make payment in dollars or euros? And that held things up for months, apparently. So there's always these payment issues between Russia and Iran.
And on the side of Iranian weapons transfers to Russia, I mean, do you guys expect that to continue as it has done over the past 18 months on drones in particular, or do you think now, given the tensions in the Middle East and the risks of a regional escalation, that Iran might grow more hesitant to supply the quantity of, I guess, in particular drones, or to provide other weapon systems than might have been otherwise?
Well, there's also the issue that the Russians are apparently building their own factory to manufacture Iranian drones or enhance the Iranian drones. So it's not clear that they need to have, to actually import them directly from Iran if they can manufacture them themselves. But I would imagine that even if Iran decides that it needs to keep some weapons, that they're going to continue this selling them. This is what makes them more equal with Russia, this being able to sell Russia weapons, that they're not sort of just a junior partner, they're more of an equal partner. So I would suspect personally that they would keep this up. This would be a high priority thing for them to do.
Yeah, I agree. I think that right now Iran really appreciates the fact that they can sell their equipment to the Russians. So when Shoigu came and visited Iran in September, I think this year, a lot of the armaments and weapons that were on display were the kind that Iran has given to non-state actors previously. And there has been speculation about missiles being provided to the Russians. I haven't really seen much indication about the movement of that and whether that deal has come to fruition. But this is something that is also going to kind of emerge and widen the relationship. On the joint drone production in Russia, it doesn't seem like Iran will be shipping more drones now since they have this facility, at least once it's constructed. And that's also why a lot of the kind of shipments right now are going through the Caspian Sea rather than through air, which started at the beginning of the war. And so there's been people who've been tracking the flights, and that's where most of the procurement's happening by ships, which are larger quantities. So it does seem like this is developing, and it really, I think we don't really know how much further it can go at this point, just because there's not a lot of indications that the ballistic missiles are going to be sold to the Russians at the moment.
But I think it's potentially more pernicious than this, and I'll say why. The production line the Russians have set up to produce these drones, they are not making the drones exactly the way Iran made the drones. They're improving them. They're improving the software. Russia is doing something that Iran hasn't been able to do. So Russia is putting these drones against a near-peer adversary. So if you look at a lot of the Western equipment that's flowed to Ukraine, Russia is having the same issues that a lot of Western countries are having now. So we produce weapons. We thought these weapons were great, but they never were tested out in a real battle space where they were going against a near-peer adversary. And so it's a test bed. Ukraine's a test bed. It's a testing ground. And there's been some issues with the Shahed and how it's been at. And Russia's learning a lot about electronic warfare. They're learning about jamming and countermeasures. And it would be my supposition, I've never been in the factory, so I can't tell you, that they're making them smaller and they're doing other things to them as well. And I think that pernicious part of it is they could pass on those improvements and technology back to Iran, which makes Iran more of a threat to equipment that we always thought was superior to Iran. And that's something else that I think we ought to be focused on, because if Russia's learning these things against very sophisticated Western equipment and capabilities. And how is it going to turn that around? Is it going to give that knowledge to Iran, who can then use it against countries that didn't have to worry about those things before?
And following up on that, do you think there are other lessons from Russia's fighting in Ukraine, whether on strategic or a tactical level, or on this more technical level, as far as drone productions that Iran will be taking from watching how the war has progressed over the past almost 20 months now?
I think that it's very interesting. Someone in the military once gave me a great analogy that I'm going to use here, and I just want to, I wish I could credit him, but I can't remember who it was. But Ukraine has turned, Ukraine's ability to change tactics and strategy in this war is sort of like that cigarette boat that is in the ocean that's running drugs, between Latin America and Miami, for example. Russia changes sort of like an aircraft carrier. It does not turn on a dime, and it's very slow. I think one of the lessons Iran is learning is don't be like Russia in terms of force structure, what you do, how you mass your forces, and that you have to be lighter, more dynamic, more flexible than Russia has been. They're learning that. But I do think there's a huge number of lessons in AI, unmanned warfare, and the like. I think some of that was seen during, in the Hamas attack about how you use drones more effectively. A lot of that wasn't thought about before people watched what happened in Ukraine. And it's very interesting. So the Shahed drone, for example, you fly this so low that it's not necessarily going to be picked up on a radar. And the Ukrainians had a version that said, the train, it sounds like a train. So you hear this humming noise, like a buzzing noise, and that's how you knew it was coming in. So you didn't have a huge amount of advance warning that it was going to strike. So your ability to shoot down all of these was necessarily attenuated because you didn't know when it was going to come. You weren't picking it up. So a lot of that technology and that knowledge of how you can use these is already out there. And there's inevitably going to be much more. So the next step of this is going to be the electronic warfare. Can you jam these effectively so you don't have to worry about picking them up on the radar because you knock them out before they get launched? Can you do something? Can you counter the jammers? That sort of thing. And that's the sort of technology that's being developed now, which I think is making the U.S. Army and Navy and the Marine Corps re-looking at how they do weapons procurement, how you're looking for the future. We heard from some of our NATO allies recently about what they're looking at in terms of weapons procurement because of those lessons. So I think this is across the board.
Yeah. I don't know if there's anything you guys would want to add if we're seeing changes to Iranian force posture or to the Iranian military following lessons learned from Ukraine.
Well, the Iranian military is very different than the Russian military. I mean, you have the traditional Artesh and kind of the more what you would associate with professionalized militaries, and then you have the IRGC. And they each have their own air force, they each have their own navy, they each have their own kind of defense procurement networks. And so Iran, and this has been a historic thing that Iran has done, is they are studying Russia's way of war. In the 90s, they studied Chechnya very closely. They've studied Syria and Russia's tactics, even though they weren't involved in it. So I do think that Iran is studying the war. I'm not sure in terms of their perceptions of it, how applicable certain aspects of it are. But I mean, I do definitely think that like the role of unmanned vehicles, it's kind of the AI aspects of it. I mean, I'm sure Iran is studying that.
And could I ask as well we've spoken a lot about the trends and dynamics which are bringing these two countries together, but if there are forces domestically, whether ideologies or forces say within Iran who supported the JCPOA or might want sanctions relief, who might be pushing in a different direction here, or hesitancy on the Russian side to build closer ties with Iran, or whether this is kind of a one-way unanimous push for a closer relationship between the two parts.
Well, I think that any elements seeking better relations with the West in both countries are definitely very weak at the moment. So I don't think that I don't think either has to worry that the other is going to suddenly have a détente with the West. That's for sure. Now, what I do think, though, is that just prior to the events in Hamas, we had the war, or the very quick military action of Azerbaijan against Armenia in Nagorno-Karabakh, and then there's this question of the Azeris establishing a corridor along the Iranian border to their exclave Nakhichevan. And I think the Iranians are very unhappy about this, that they actually value their relationship with Armenia and the ability to trade through Armenia. And if this is going to be cut off, this just makes Iran more dependent for its trade on Azerbaijan and Russia. And I don't think that they want this to happen. On the other hand, the Russians are clearly not shy about putting the Iranians in a position where they don't have much choice. And so I think that this is an issue that sort of the Iranian unhappiness about what Azerbaijan has done. And traditionally, of course, the Russians have defended the Armenians. They haven't done so now. It's partly they don't like the Armenian government, but also partly because they really can't do anything because they are preoccupied in Ukraine. And so I think that this in particular is something that the Iranians are unhappy about, and that I'm not quite sure what they're going to do. Are they just going to essentially take it, or what? But it's just another example of how, despite their cooperation, that they will each take actions that do not benefit the other.
I would also add to that is I think within their domestic environments, there is a real convergence on like the security services. Like that has been something that's really has been apparent throughout the years. However, even within Iran, I think in the Iranian case, it's much more prevalent, even though by many means there is a kind of antagonism towards anyone who's pro-Western in Iran. There is a lot of mistrust within Iran, and even within Iranian diplomats, there was this issue over the UAE and the recognition of the islands that came out recently, and the Russians, of course, came out recognizing the United Arab Emirates' sovereignty over these islands, which Iran was very upset about. I think that there are parts of Iran, especially within the IRGC, also within the kind of the Supreme National Security Council, that are more inclined towards Russia. But there is still this distrust, and I think this distrust has remained and will likely remain just because Russia has in the past really put Iran in a difficult position.
I just want to mention the huge 500-ton elephant in the room, which is Turkey. And I just think you can't really talk about Nakhichevan, Nagorno-Karabakh, you can't talk about Azeris and Armenia without mentioning Turkey. And some saw this as not so much that Russia could intervene because it's losing some of its cachet there, but also sort of like a give me to Turkey and its relationship with Azerbaijan. And so I just want to put that out there without further comment.
Thank you. And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about how the current Israeli-Hamas conflict has been impacting the Moscow-Tehran relationship. I mean, obviously, we've seen Russia traditionally, over the past years, try to balance relations with Iran with closer relationships with Israel, which notably hasn't followed Western sanctions or provided weapons to Ukraine, which Ukrainian officials have repeatedly been asking for, especially regarding missile defenses. I'm wondering how the current unrest in the region might impact this relationship and whether this might force Russia to pick sides more clearly here. I know you've written on this.
Right. There's been a lot of press commentary, including a very interesting article recently in Time magazine, as I recall, talking about how, obviously Russia benefits from the fact that there is a distraction factor, that the world, instead of focusing on what Russia is doing in Ukraine, they're focusing on what Israel is doing in Gaza, and that to the extent that the United States, if it diverts weapons intended for Ukraine to Israel, then obviously this would help Russia. But I think it's also important to note that Russia also runs some risks as a result of this. In other words, that I think Russia benefits when its policy of juggling between opposing sides, when conflict is simmering between them. In other words, if peace breaks out, then, well, who needs Russia? But peace doesn't seem to be threatening to break out in the Middle East anytime soon. But when war escalates, then this forces the Russians to very quickly make decisions about, do they support the weaker side and therefore alienate the stronger side, or do they do nothing and then maybe alienate the weaker side as well, and risk looking powerless? And it strikes me that Russia really isn't in a very strong position to do much to help Hamas. And I think that if the war spreads to the north, in other words, to Hezbollah-Israel conflict, and that the Israelis and potentially the United States with its aircraft carrier in the region pounds Hezbollah, well, this I think would be very difficult for Russia. In other words, does this mean, if there's an Israeli-Hezbollah conflict, does this mean Hezbollah will withdraw fighters from Syria, where they've been defending the Assad regime, to the conflict in Lebanon? Does this mean that Russia's job in Syria is all the more difficult at a time when they really can't afford to devote more resources to Syria? And so I actually believe Putin when he says that what he wants to see is a ceasefire with regard to Gaza. I think that would definitely be in Russia's interest. That I think there are real risks for Russia to see this conflict both endure and spread.
If either of you have any comments on what the kind of increased tensions might mean for the Russia-Iran relationship?
I think both Russia and Iran risk quite a bit if this involves both of them. Well, at least if it involves Iran, for example. So from Iran's perspective, at least what they've been saying publicly is that this is part of the axis of resistance. This is, we will support the Gazans. However, I think that within Iran, that really puts them in a very dangerous and precarious situation. Iran would directly become involved in a conflict with Israel, which in the past has occurred, especially in Syria. However, it would also mean retaliation for Iran and for its proxies throughout the Middle East. And Iran's just not in the position right now, especially economically, to weather this long, prolonged conflict, which needs arms, which needs supplies, which needs monetary support for these groups. It just wouldn't be able to sustain this in terms of its national interest. So whereas Iran may eventually be dragged into it, perhaps by one of its groups, by Hezbollah, for example, I don't see, in terms of like a rational cost-benefit analysis, whether or not this is really plausible or very smart on the Iranian part.
And just a comment, I think the overlap of who needs what, Ukraine versus Israel in terms of weapons, is hugely overstated. There's only one or two types of systems that are similar that what the U.S. is supplying to Ukraine versus Russia, some of that is obviously ammunition. I'm going to say an unpopular statement here, but one I support, which is the United States has hundreds of thousands of DPICMs, these short-range cluster munitions that can be used for ammunition. And they've already been flowing, and people have objected to it. My view is you're using them to blow up minefields. You're using them to kill Russians who are trying to kill you. So I don't understand what the hand-wringing is about. That's me. And in terms of everything else, the only other overlap is JDAMs, and we have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of those, and Boeing makes thousands of them. So I think there's been this almost a canard of a competition that has been set up here, and it's not an accurate one. And I think Russia loves that canard, and they probably are feeding it with their disinformation to people on the Hill who want to separate these two things because of things like that.
Yeah. No, I agree that the use of the DPICMs and cluster munitions in fields in Ukraine is a completely different matter to in urban warfare or in the kinds of areas in which human rights organizations have typically objected to their use.
Right, and just one last point. 40%, fully 40% of all territory that was occupied in Ukraine by Russia has been landmined. The world has never seen mines used like this ever in the history of the world.
Yeah. And we've seen rumors today from the Wall Street Journal that Wagner may be considering providing Hezbollah with missile defense systems. I'm wondering what you guys make of this, where these, perhaps directed towards the two of you primarily, but where these missile defense systems might be coming from, what we might be looking at, and if this were to happen, and what you guys make of this.
I mean, I'm paywalled on the Wall Street Journal, so I just know about.
I'll note Time Magazine currently doesn't have a paywall, so a little promo there.
But from what I've heard, is it seems to be that they've picked up some signals intelligence of Hezbollah and the Wagner Group. I mean, Russia's moved out one of their S-300s from Syria to the field to Ukraine. Russia does have one in Latakia, but the Wagner Group hasn't had control of their missile defense systems in Syria. So, from my knowledge in this situation, I don't know the details at the moment, but it does seem somewhat strange, and it would be a very big shift if this does happen.
I'd be overjoyed to find out from where these missiles are going to come. For Wagner or for anyone else. Russia has used air defense missiles in attack helicopters for other things. They are doing things. We talk about Ukraine being very innovative and the like. The Russians have also been taking things that are traditionally used for one thing and used it for another thing. And the Russians are also looking ahead. And if Ukraine gets, when Ukraine gets the F-16s, and as they get longer range fires, that's going to start suppressing Russian air defense. So they're not likely, I don't think, to give up a bunch of these to someone else when they need them desperately to hold on to Crimea.
And if I could just add also, I think that since the death of Prigozhin, that there's no longer any plausible deniability that Wagner acts separately from Russia, not even implausible deniability, that basically I think that Wagner has essentially been taken over by the Russian Defense Ministry. So, it struck me as sort of an odd rumor because, it's if Wagner, anything Wagner now does, it's the Russian state is doing. So, why even bother to say it? So, yeah, and in addition to all the other caveats that have been expressed.
Interesting. So we'll just have to wait and see where that one develops. But it sounds like there's a bit of skepticism about how plausible and whether Wagner, let alone Russia, would have the capacity to provide this at the moment. I'd like to have a quick PSA to people watching to keep on sending questions in via the chat. We've got a couple coming in here, but we'll be opening for a public Q&A shortly. So if there's anything you guys are wondering about that we haven't covered so far, please do drop it in the chat. And I'd like to ask as well what you think, if this conflict were to escalate, what choices Russia would have? I mean, do you think there's a risk that Russia would intervene militarily if Iran were to get involved in a wider conflict? Or do you think, given how quagmired Russia is in Ukraine, that Russia would want to see this one out, maybe provide some kind of support. I mean, moving a little bit into the realm of hypotheticals here, but I'm wondering how this might play out on the relationship if things were to escalate further and we see Iran get involved somehow.
I personally just don't think that Russia wants to get involved in a conflict on the ground with Israel, not at all. I think that they would want to stay out of it. And personally, I don't think Iran wants to get involved in such a conflict either. But if it does, I think that the Russians will do their best to evade it. In fact, I don't think they're in a position to even give weapons. So yeah, I think that I believe them when they say they want a ceasefire. They don't want to see conflict taking a broader conflict that would make them have harder choices.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Russia would intervene militarily to support Iran if Iran does get involved. I mean, even in Syria, where there's been Russian and Iranian cooperation, there's been instances with Israeli airstrikes that Russia just won't turn on their air defenses to support Iranian troops. And right now, actually, there is. I mean, I think what policymakers in Russia might be concerned about is an escalation in southern Syria. That's something that is a big flashpoint. There's Russian military police there, but there is a lot of IRGC and also Lebanese Hezbollah in southern Syria. So kind of it could derail some of Russia's post-war aspirations of kind of reconciliation in Syria. So this does bring in some dynamics that kind of pose how much larger of a conflict this could be, and I don't think Russia wants to see that.
And there's an energy aspect to this as well. Chevron announced today that regardless of what's going on, they're still going to invest heavily in the Leviathan gas field of Israel. They're not walking away. There's a lot of multinational corporations who are not walking away from East Med gas. But there's a big Russia problem here as well, because that gas frequently has to go through the Black Sea. Russia has thoroughly did untethered sea mines throughout the Black Sea that are hitting all sorts of things. I think 4 vessels already, including a tourist vessel, were hit in the Romanian port of Constanța. So there is this huge transit piece too that people have to be looking at of, how the oil and gas gets from point X to point Y. People forget about the transit of things from the East Med through the Bosporus and into the Black Sea, and they forget where the Danube is located, which is on the Black Sea, and therefore getting gas to countries that have been a little more friendly, like the election of Fico in Slovakia, and it's landlocked, and that they'll still want to get those things there. So I think I'm not going to guess whether Russia has the wherewithal to do this now, but they have some waning naval assets here, and I'm not sure that they have the naval capability at this point without moving a whole lot of stuff from the Far East. And despite this sort of weird relationship between China and Russia, I think that's a blip on the radar scope. That's not, they still see, they know who their enemies are. I don't think they want to move all that. So part of this is control of those sea lanes as well in the East Med. And I don't think Russia wants to play that game right now, because then it affects their ability to control freedom of navigation in the Black Sea as well.
Interesting. And if I could ask, I know we've spoken about this previously a little bit, but what you've made of Russia's, response to the Hamas attacks on October 7th. Obviously, we've seen Hamas officials welcomed in Moscow shortly afterwards, and a hesitation to condemn the Hamas attacks as terrorism, and both in public statements and in the UN Security Council. I mean, do you think this is a testament of Russia trying to play to balance the relationships with Israel and now increasingly with Iran, or do you think this is? I mean, what do you think this is about, this response?
Well, certainly they didn't condemn at first the Hamas attack. Now, recently, after the incident in Dagestan, I think there was a statement more condemning terrorism, and I think even mentioning terrorism against Israelis. So I think that they are. They've tried to sort of have this even-handed game. On the other hand, sort of the Russian argument is that It was the George W. Bush administration that insisted on holding Palestinian elections in 2006, which Hamas won. Therefore, that makes Hamas a legitimate actor, and therefore they are dealing with a legitimate actor, Hamas. They might not condone its actions, but that it's an actor that has to be dealt with. And so I think that they're holding out the prospect of Russian mediation, but it's also a good excuse for not getting too thoroughly, in other words, to keep in touch with everyone. They've long argued that their ability to talk to everyone now puts them in a better position than the U.S. to bring about mediation, but of course, talking to everyone alone doesn't seem to do it. I think basically it's more about keeping in tune with Sunni Arab governments in particular about this crisis. I think that the Russian position and the position of the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others are fairly close, and that I think is the Russians I think are playing more of a diplomatic game or a public outreach game. That it's not they don't envision necessarily an active role for themselves with regard to this conflict.
And do you think there would be any prospect for Russian-led mediation of the ongoing conflict?
No, I don't. None.
Yeah. No, I agree. But I mean, you've seen some statements of the Russians saying they want to do this, but obviously we've seen far less engagement than even the Qataris or others who also have close relationships
conflict
with Hamas.
resolution requires either an ability to threaten someone, either you back down or else, or an ability to provide goods to someone. In other words, if you do this, then you will get that. And I don't think that Russia is in a strong position to do either at this particular moment.
And given the growing relationship between Iran and Russia, I'm wondering what you guys think would be the options available to the US and its allies to increase the cost of this cooperation, limit some of its most damaging effects, perhaps in terms of sanction circumvention, nuclear ties, weapons development, if there are kind of policy measures available, or if given the depth of existing sanctions and the political consensus around this, that the political costs of building some kind of ties with Russia and Iran would simply be too high for the US and its allies at the moment?
Well, one of the challenges with sanctions, especially on components and technology, is that Russia and Iran have established kind of networks to get them through third parties. But even with Iranian drones, the components in it are not very sophisticated. Iran can get some of these components from like Amazon. I mean, they're like T9 is one of the main parts of the drones. Like, I mean, these kind of this kind of area is not really. It's somewhat difficult to sanction, but it's also it's also available. I think the technology side of it with more advanced components definitely is a way that the U.S. can exert pressure, and they have been doing that quite successfully, especially bringing out the kind of networks that have been established between the two countries. They're both struggling to make payments outside of the U.S. dollar, and I think the U.S. dollar and kind of the global financial system that is shaped around essentially the American dollar is one lever. And so there is I think Russia has managed to survive a bit with economically since the war, and there's definitely indications that their GDP is staying afloat. But it's about how long they can sustain this, and whether or not other parties beyond Russia and Iran are willing to support them either through trade or through kind of this illicit transfer network, which we've seen.
A couple of things. The first is the first action I would take if I were the United States is to put the Houthis back on the terrorism list. I mean, I thought that was a huge mistake. It was a gift to Iran for the nuclear agreement. I don't think it ever should have happened, and within 24 hours, the Houthis showed that they really are a terrorist organization. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, Russia has told us in many ways who they are. We should believe them. They're deadly, they're nasty, they want to kill a lot of people, and even the Israelis should understand their limitations to what this relationship with Russia has given them and will give them in the future. The third thing is on sanctions. I don't think the United States has done a great job, neither has the EU, on doing the kind of sanctions that we were really good at in the 90s and in the first part of this century. There are a huge amount of sanctions that were not implemented through Treasury, but were implemented through the Commerce Department, through State Department non-proliferation regimes, like the Missile Technology Control Regime, where we looked at dual-use technologies much more carefully, and we were very good at working with our allies and partners to implement those. A lot of those has fallen by the wayside for whatever reason. State Department may be focused more on, who knows, sort of arms control versus these non-proliferation things. But there's a lot of dual-use things that are still showing up in Russia and showing up in Iran that may not have showed up in the 90s. Because the Commerce Department has not been active on this like they were in previous decades. So I think the Treasury sanctions have been very effective, but I'm wondering where the rest of the US government is on this, because what was very robust even a decade ago seems to have fallen by the wayside.
Yeah. And do you have a sense of why that has fallen by the wayside? Obviously, we've just seen a massive increase in sanctions over, say, the past 2 decades. So I'm curious what you make of the failure of sanctions in this area.
I honestly don't know if it's personality driven. I don't know why they're not. I mean, the rules are still on the books. There's all these regimes that are still on the books. I don't know if they don't have the right person, if this was not a priority for this administration and the previous administration. I don't know. I do know that in the 90s and in the early 2000s, we stopped a lot of things, like even a thermometer for a vat where the Iranians were claiming they were like making fertilizer stuff, and it turned out a thermometer can be used to regulate the development of chemical weapons. And we were able to stop things like that. And there just doesn't seem the motivation to do that now, like even from specialty steel, which used to be very common, as Nicole knows, under the Missile Technology Control Regime. That seems to have fallen by the wayside. So a lot of the ability for Russia and Iran to continue producing the weapons that they produce is not just computer chips, but it's all these other kinds of small parts that they could not possibly get when we were being a little more strict on this. So I have no idea why the focus has been so exclusively on Treasury and those kind of issues and not enough on these dual and triple use technologies.
And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts as well on what the US and its allies might be able to do to either limit this cooperation or to punish it.
Well, what I do think is we need to have a conversation with our traditional partners in the region, with the Saudis, with the Emiratis, the Qataris, and the Israelis about maybe cooperating with Russia as much as they have been doing isn't really paying off for them, and that maybe some of these things are have linkages, whether it's obviously, Iran is helping Russia in Ukraine, that maybe there are linkages between what's going on in Ukraine and what's going on in the Middle East. That the argument that we can't offend Russia because, or can't really care about Ukraine because we need to be concerned about what's happening in this part of the world. I think we need to start looking at the linkages between these two conflicts and having a discussion with our allies. You expect us to do X, Y, and Z for you. We need you to do A, B, and C for us as well. That's where I think we need to. In other words, it's not simply a question of what we do about our adversaries. It's about how we manage our allies.
And Deborah, I know you had some thoughts as well on the linkages between the war in Ukraine and the conflict in the Middle East.
I think I'm gonna throw out this dirty word, escalation. I think we need to get off of this possibility if we offend Russia, they'll escalate. I think we need to, we know where Russia is, we know what they are and they're not going to do. We know what the potential is, but part of the reason why we haven't done what you just discussed, Mark, is because they're afraid of Russian escalation. I think that is largely an unfounded fear. I think it allows Russia to be in the driver's seat. And it has caused us to be timid in our approach to arming Ukraine. So many of the things that we said they couldn't have because Russia would escalate have now gone to Ukraine. I think that it's time to just, call the bluff and move on. And I think it's the definition of insanity to think that if somehow Putin falls, the world will have Armageddon. I think we need to move on and understand that things will happen in Russia. And it doesn't mean the rest of, you're not going to go back to the arms control table and have a normal conversation with Russia on arms control. It's not going to happen again. So I think it's time to sort of abandon what I think are largely fantasies and understand who Russia is, what it is, and what its goals are, which is absolute unmitigated chaos in as many places as possible so that the United States and others cannot move in to fill that void. And I think we would do better to understand those linkages and understand that we are also a superpower, the greatest one on the face of the planet, and it's time to act like that.
And do you think that goes for Iran and its proxies in the region as well? Obviously, we've seen a number of strikes, drone strikes on US military bases in Iraq and Syria. As a journalist, it's been hard to keep up with DoD's numbers, which just keep on going up. I think it's around 27 last time I checked. And we've seen some response there a couple of days ago.
I'm not going to do spilled milk here, but when this administration decided not to respond, what was it, almost 2 years ago when El Tanf was hit, one of the first times in this administration, there was no outcry, there was no public recrimination by this administration, and there was no action. It wasn't just the Reaper drones that everyone knows about that were shot down in the Black Sea, but a number of Reaper drones that were supporting U.S. Special Operations Forces in Syria and Iraq as well were shot down, and we didn't respond. So we already had sort of laid this groundwork of, please hit me again, I'm not going to hit you back. And so now it's, now you're just going to, you're like the 3-year-old. I got away with it the first time. Let me just keep doing this. Now I've done it 25, 27, 29 times. This is not recent. This has been going on for a long time. And I think my colleagues here know that even 6 weeks before the Hamas attack on Israel, there was a huge uptick in these as well. And playing chicken with U.S. naval assets in the region is what Iran was doing as well. So I think when you don't respond, it encourages your adversary to take more action and see how far they can go. And so I think we kind of did not respond well to the first ones, which we should have. And now we're in this bind where you're going to have to see how effective this concept of deterrent of 2 carrier battle groups actually in the region going to be. How much of a deterrent is that vice? Do these proxies, and I'm going to just say Iran, because proxies I think is too gentle, how much do they think they can get away with picking on the edges here before you get this thing? I mean, that's a real gamble here. That's just a really bad game of poker.
And regarding these proxies, I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts about whether there are existing ties between Russia and not just Iran, but also with its proxies. Obviously, we've seen the rumors today of regarding air defense to Hezbollah, but I'm wondering if there are what these relationships with Iranian-supported proxies across the region on Russia's end look like.
I mean, I wouldn't call Hamas an Iranian proxy.
Yeah.
But Russia does have relations with Hamas, and it's actually quite historic. Russia's hosted periodic delegations of Hamas. I know the recent one was covered quite extensively, but Russia's is kind of what Mark was talking about before. Russia tried to talk to everyone in the Middle East and to show that it could play this mediating role. Russia's operated on the battlefield next to Hezbollah. That happened in Syria. This was part of the Battle of Aleppo. Russian air support have provided, have supported Iranian proxies on the ground. But I mean, I do think that Iran and obviously supports these proxies, but they do at times also act independently of Iran and sometimes to the detriment of Iran. And so that's something that I think we should be looking closely at, because it does seem right now that Hezbollah is far more enthusiastic about this axis of resistance getting drawn in than at least some of the Iranian statements that have been coming out. So, I mean, this dynamic is really fascinating because Russia does have relations with them outside of its ties to Iran. But especially with Hezbollah, that is tied to their involvement in Syria. So it's a big web of, conflicting ties.
Well, I think we're shortly going to wrap up the part of the session where I get to ask all of the questions I have of our experts here. So please do keep on sending your questions in online. Before we wrap up this part, I'm wondering if each of you just wants to summarize your thoughts on the Russia-Iran relationship. Any closing remarks, where this might go, or how you'd define the relationship? Maybe we'll start here.
Well, I think that Nicole had a piece a year or so ago with the Foreign Policy Research Institute in which she described the relationship as one of frenemies. Is that they're not enemies, they're not friends either. That they cooperate, but they also have difficulties. And that I think is the thing, is that there's a trust factor. And when you throw in something like Hezbollah, Deborah talked about the Iranian tail wagging the Russian dog. Sometimes I think it's the Hezbollah tail wagging the Iranian dog. In other words, that in international relations, it's not just the big ones that sort of direct the activities of the smaller ones. The smaller ones have an awful lot of agency and create situations in which they do things and then force their larger patrons to simply accept it or to support them. And I think that is a dynamic I think that is most fearful. And certainly what Nicole pointed out about Hezbollah being more enthusiastic about conflict, that I think, in other words, I think that they wouldn't mind getting into a conflict which they would feel Iran would have to support them, and so that wouldn't bother them, and that's the dynamic I think we have to worry about.
I mean, I think one thing to look at this relationship is how the domestic governments or the domestic leadership have coalesced around a common vision of opposition to the Western-led international order, and how they've been emboldened by foreign policy mistakes perhaps on behalf of the West. So I think the withdrawal from the JCPOA really emboldened Raisi and the hardline elements in Iran. And that, I think, is really in part one of the reasons why we see this relationship between Russia and Iran, where Iran was essentially given the option of China or Russia after the withdrawal from the JCPOA. And that was, I think, when you really start to see more collaboration around 2018, 2019. They had the ties in Syria. That was really important to establishing it. But with this kind of mutual feeling of marginalization, whether real or imaginary, the Russians and the Iranians have kind of built this kind of zombie alliance or alignment together. And I think that's a really interesting development when we think about how things that somehow are not related can actually have pretty unforsaken consequences.
Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit of umbrage here, which is that the Soviet Union and then Russia has had strong relations with Hamas and Hezbollah for over 40 plus years. This is not new. And this was with Iran and separate from Iran. The Soviet Union and then Russia had illicit transfers of equipment to Iran going back to the 80s on this to help Iran's nuclear program. And with this classic Russian thing of we're so far superior, there's no way these guys will ever reverse engineer anything because they're not as smart as we are, and then use it to make nuclear weapons. And the Russians have made this mistake for decades about underestimating the countries that they're dealing with. So I think that some of this was already in place. A lot of it was already in place. And it's not as new as some people suggest it is. It's just more forceful. It's more out there. Russia was very helpful to Hezbollah in 2006 and 2007 in terms of replacing arms and equipment for that war with Israel. So this is not all new. And as I said, Russia has told us many times who they are. We just refuse to believe it.
With that, somber note, I think we'll turn to some of the questions we've gotten in here. So one question we've gotten is, what are the implications of the Israel-Hamas war on the relationship between Putin and Netanyahu? If we have any takers there.
Not good.
Yeah.
I think that I think that this is an example of where sort of a degree of camaraderie between leaders can't overcome actual difference between the interests of the states that they represent. And I think that this is an issue where I think the Israelis really, Netanyahu can't finesse this. He can't somehow argue that his relationship with Putin has benefited Israel in this regard.
I mean, the relationship between Putin and Netanyahu used to be quite close. And one of Putin's foreign policy initiatives, starting in the early 2000s, was really forging a close relationship with the more far right within Israel. This has really, collapsed. I think even prior to the outbreak of hostilities and the horrific terrorist attacks of October 7th, I think that this was already ongoing. And it might have been because of the changes in government within Israel, but the Russia-Israel relationship is in probably the lowest place it's been in years.
And I agree with Nicole that, finally, right? So, is that I think in many months leading up to what Hamas did, there was already a view of the Israeli military that this was not a beneficial relationship. The Russians were not being as good about deconflicting some of the air stuff, some of the launches. There was no early warning. All that was falling by the wayside, and I would argue that happened a good 3 to 4 months before this. And for whatever reasons, I go to the experts on Iran and Syria and on why that is. But so I think that in many ways, Netanyahu was sort of the last man standing, thinking that, much like certain other people who I won't mention thought, well, I can have a personal relationship with Vladimir Putin and it'll all end well. And it never does. And so I think this is going to be harder to sustain. I think from a perspective of Ukraine on this, does this mean Israel will finally agree to do something? Well, Israel's not going to give, weapons to Ukraine while they're in the middle of a war with others, but they could allow third-party transfers of Israeli-based equipment, some of which is in Europe now that the Israelis have not allowed to go to Ukraine, and they may give the okay for that to go to Ukraine, and I think that would be a big step forward.
And do you think we're gradually seeing the end of the Israeli-Russia relationship? Or do you think, there have been challenges to this relationship before. Do you think there are a chance that, they can continue to have some kind of pragmatism, especially around Syria? Or do you think that this will become increasingly difficult now if the conflict continues in the Middle East and in Ukraine?
Both sides will want to keep some kind of relationship. I think that both see it as valuable. I think both Putin and Netanyahu will be loath to give it up, but whether it has much positive content, I think, is it's hard to see going forward. I think it depends on how this current Gaza crisis ends and how soon it ends. If it ends soon, which I don't anticipate, then maybe they can get back to a certain degree of business as usual. But so long as it's going on, I don't think they'll be able to.
It would be interesting if, in the past, Russia's actually managed to be pretty adept in some of its, backdeal negotiations with the Israelis and the Syrians. So if you recall when the COVID pandemic was, really rampant and the Sputnik vaccine, Russia managed to negotiate the release of an Israeli prisoner in Syria by having the Israelis purchase that vaccine, and then they provided it to Syria. So if Russia actually comes up with some kind of motion of goodwill to the Israelis, I think that would go quite a far way if it comes to negotiating certain hostage release. But I don't see this radically improving at the level it was maybe like a year or two ago. I think that's would take a lot more effort on that part.
Agree.
All right, so moving on to a question here on Armenia and Azerbaijan. So in recent years, since the Second Karabakh War in 2020, Iran and Armenia built close relations in the military sphere while Russia didn't support Armenia as much as they did in the past. Do you think Iran can become another type of Russia, i.e. a military supporter for Armenia against Azerbaijan? Would Iran support Armenia over Azerbaijan? And what are the main interests of Iran in the relations between Azerbaijan and Armenia?
I think Armenia is in a difficult position because after losing Russian support, Armenia's main friends are America and Iran. And of course, they don't work very well together. And I have a feeling that both America and Iran will be pushing Armenia to choose one or the other. I think that it will be very difficult for the U.S. to do much for Armenia, well, in any event, but it'll be especially difficult if Armenia is seen to be cooperating with Iran. In fact, that might be a useful excuse not to do anything for Armenia.
I think a red line for Iran, though, is losing its land border with Armenia. And if there is any more movement about the Azerbaijanis that would threaten that, which it doesn't seem like this is on the table at the moment, but that would be a pretty big red line for Iran. Iran's done a lot of military exercises in the north in order to prepare for that. I think that Iran also is somewhat dependent on Azerbaijan for the development of some of these transcontinental corridors. Azerbaijan is paying for the construction of this railroad, the Rash-Astara Railroad, and Iran's really dependent on that as well. So it's very difficult. Iran is worried about separatism and kind of the emboldening of certain Azeri elements in its north, but I don't see Iran being like Armenia's #1 military supplier or supporter.
So I go back to Turkey again, and also Israel. So one of Israel's closest relationships in that part of the world is with Azerbaijan. It's been a long time relationship. There was a substantial Jewish population, and they were called the Mountain Jews, who lived in Azerbaijan, that were attacked by Armenians, 150 years ago, that sort of thing. In many ways, that part of the Caucasus is like the Middle East. You're talking thousands of years of animosity and control. I think part of Putin standing down was related to what their bandwidth was, what their capacity is, but the other part of it is if he can throw a sop to Erdogan to keep him disruptive and sort of where he would like him to be, that's not out of the question either. And it's something that I would keep in mind because this was, Turkey came in this full bore and said, this is ours now. That puts Turkey odds with Iran, and Turkey still gets, 20% of its gas supplies from Iran and about 40% from Russia. I think that'll change. Turkey has a new gas field opening up, but that's also something to keep in mind. There is that dynamic there.
Very interesting. Well, I think unless there are any other questions coming in, that we might wrap it there. Yeah, and I hope you'll all join me in a round of applause for our experts here, and that you've all enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. And thanks again to the Atlantic Council for putting this on.